The following is a short video clip from Special Agent Ezzo to update our mock White House task force on some new developments.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Special Agent Ezzo of the FBI. The President has asked me to come here today to update you on a particularly disturbing development regarding a religious extremist group here inside the United States. Intelligence sources indicate an increase in activity by a particularly volatile religious extremist group called the Samists. The Samists are led by a charismatic leader named Sam. Sam bases his religious operations out of his yurt compound just outside of Youngstown, Ohio. He's estimated to recruited about 27,500 followers today, and these numbers are growing fast. We don't currently know much about the Samist religious tenets. Group members are intensely secretive and shun the outside world. What we do know is that they tend to recruit almost exclusively from friends and family members of those individuals who are already part of the group. All we know is that Sam used to be involved with the Branch Davidians, but was eventually banned from this organization for his militant, violent interpretation of religion. The President would appreciate any insight you have into the following. First, how or why a group or splinter group turned into such violence? Secondly, how can such violent trends be reversed? And finally, are there any examples of groups that have successfully eliminated these violent elements from their organizations? We look forward to your analysis, and we sincerely thank you for your time and effort in this matter.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Professor Raymond Koo. I'll be moderating this panel for this portion of this morning. And I'd first like to introduce Dr. Sheldon Solomon, who is a professor of psychology and Ross Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Skidmore College. He is an experimental social psychologist whose interests include the nature of self, consciousness, and social behavior. He's the co-author of In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, and co-founder of the World Leaders Project. His talk today is entitled The Psychology of Terror, Terror Management Theory, and Religious Extremism. And we'll see how Dr. Solomon responds to our President's inquiries.
Yeah, thank you and good morning. I hope everyone can hear okay in the back. There I am. Yeah, I wish we had gotten those questions a little bit in advance, but I'll think about them as I talk, and hopefully by the end we'll have something of use to contribute towards addressing them. I'm sure, like most Americans, you probably remember where you were on the morning of September 11th, 2001. I think in the language of psychologists, that's one of these flashbulb memories that are vividly and inexorably etched in our individual and collective psyches. I happened to be at the World Trade Center that day, and only by what to me is a happy accident was I not in it at the time that the plane struck. And like a lot of Americans, I was very much in shock for the next few weeks, and in some ways pulled out of that deep, stuporous state of mind when my buddies and I got a call from the American Psychological Association in October of 2001. And they asked us to write a book from a psychological point of view to address some questions that we just heard. They said, hey, why don't you write a book? Tell us why these folks did that, why they do that to us, and please tell us how Americans will respond to that, and then tell us what we can do to prevent this from happening again. And then please write this book in 12 weeks because we're kind of in a rush. And we gave it our best, although I think it was futile in retrospect to think that we could do something compelling in that short amount of time. And I say that because I feel equally flustered already at the prospect of trying to convey to you in 25 minutes what we did haphazardly in 12 weeks. Nevertheless, I'll try to do my best. We were asked to do this work because of our 2 or so decades of research as experimental social psychologists on the psychological underpinnings of violence and ethnic conflict. And our work is in turn based on the ideas of a cultural anthropologist, a guy named Ernest Becker, who died in 1974, right before receiving the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction for a book called The Denial of Death. There's a companion piece that was published posthumously called Escape from Evil, and it's from Becker's ideas that most of our work is derived. Very simply, in a nutshell, what Becker proposed is that human beings, like all forms of life, are biologically predisposed to want to survive and to continue to live, and that should be a familiar idea. It's just basically Darwin's fundamental axiom about living things liking to stay alive. And what Darwin noted is, though, that there's lots of different ways to stay alive. A cactus does it by retaining water. A giraffe does it by having a big neck. We do it by both being highly social creatures as well as vastly intelligent creatures. And when I say intelligence, I mean in particular the rather unique human proclivity to be able to imagine something that does not yet exist and then have the audacity to transform our dreams in accordance with our desires. And that's very adaptive and very important. But moving back a little bit from Darwin, Kierkegaard in the 1840s proposed that human beings are literally so intelligent that we're uniquely aware of the fact that we're here. And once you realize that you're here, according to Kierkegaard, you necessarily experience two uniquely human emotions that he designated as awe and dread, respectively. I wish we had more time to talk about the awesome aspects of being alive. Let it just suffice to say that all of us at our best moments, I hope, wake up from time to time and just appreciate the sublime joy that comes from being a person rather than a potted plant. That's all the time I have for awe. We'll get back to that at lunch. On the other hand, Kierkegaard pointed out that while it's awesome to be alive and to know it, it's also dreadful. It's dreadful because if you're alive and you know it, unless you're a child or an idiot, you know that you will someday die. You know that your death can occur for reasons that could never be anticipated or controlled. And you also know that you're essentially a breathing piece of defecating meat, no fundamentally more significant or enduring than either a lizard or a potato. Now, according to Kierkegaard and to Becker, these are all potentially, how shall we say, demoralizing and rather discombobulating human affectations. And in fact, Becker hypothesizes that we would literally be paralyzed by abject terror if we were explicitly aware of what are arguably the only uncontroversial statements about the nature of reality that we currently have in our possession. You will someday die. It might happen at any time. And you're aspiring pincushion, a cold cut with an attitude, spam with a plan, sans the can. And what Becker suggested is that human beings solve the existential dilemma of mitigating the potentially overwhelming anxiety that's engendered by the awareness of death by using the same complex, symbolizing cognitive processes that produce the difficulty in the first place through the construction and maintenance of what anthropologists call culture. According to Becker, culture consists of humanly constructed beliefs about the nature of reality that people in groups share fundamentally to minimize the anxiety that's engendered by the awareness of death. And according to Becker, culture does that in two ways. It provides us with meaning and it gives us a sense of value. In terms of meaning, what Becker reminds us is that cultures may differ considerably, but they all share in common. Every culture that we know of provides an account of the origin of the universe. Every culture that we know of provides a prescription of how people should behave while they're here. And every culture that we know of has some vehicle for attaining immortality, either literally or symbolically, to those who behave in accordance with socially prescribed standards. So we all need to feel that life has meaning. In addition, we all need to feel that our lives in particular have value. And according to Becker, based on basic sociology, what culture does is to provide us with social roles with associated standards of contact, the satisfaction of which are standards of conduct, rather, the satisfaction of which allows you to perceive yourself as an individual of value in a world of meaning. And that's basically Becker's idea. Psychologically speaking, human beings require a sense that life has meaning, and that we as individuals have value in the context of our culturally constructed, meaningful conception of reality. And now the question is, to the extent that that's true, how does this help us understand human beings' annoying disinclination to coexist peacefully with other human beings who don't share their beliefs about the nature of reality? Here Becker has two thoughts. One, he says, is that if he's right, if your beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function, you will always have problem when you encounter those who do not share your beliefs, because if you accept the validity of an alternative conception of reality, you necessarily undermine the confidence with which you subscribe to your own, and in so doing expose yourself to the very anxiety those beliefs were constructed to minimize in the first place. I know I'm talking fast, but give me a few head shakes for an emotional boost if that made sense. All right, good. All right, thing number two is equally, if not more important for our purposes today, and this is from his Escape from Evil book. What Becker also said is that, you know what? Culture is a symbol, and it's a very powerful one at that, but no symbol is large enough to overcome the discomfort engendered by the very real physical problem of death. And using William James's very lovely language, what James said is that there's always a panic rumbling beneath the surface of consciousness. And this gets back to some of Jerry's comments coming from a psychodynamic point of view, but it need not be Freud. But from a depth psychology perspective, no culture is going to be good enough to eradicate concerns about death. Death anxiety is hypothesized to be repressed and then projected onto other individuals or groups that we designate as the all-encompassing repositories of evil, the eradication of which would render life on earth as it is in heaven. So, according to Becker's way of thinking about things, when we run into somebody who's different, or when we designate someone as a scapegoat, as a means to offload residual death anxiety, we respond to them first by derogating them or declaring them an inferior form of life, while we simultaneously try to get them to dispose of their beliefs and adopt ours instead. And if that doesn't work, just kill them, thus proving that your God is the right one after all. From Becker's point of view, ethnic strife and violence has a psychological component above and beyond the very legitimate political, economic, and other factors that are no doubt need to be considered in any reasonable discussion of these matters. To be silly for a moment, if Iraq was the world's largest repository of dog shit, I don't think we'd be overly concerned about importing our values as much as we purport to be in light of their petroleum-based reserves. Well, one question that should arise is, well, how do we know that Becker's ideas are true? They're easily dismissed as psychoanalytically derived philosophical speculation. Here's where it gets tough, and I don't expect you to take my word for it. Maybe you could, if you're interested, read some of the materials that we've written in this regard. These are Becker's ideas, and what my colleagues and I have done for almost 25 years is to conduct over 200 experiments where we ask people to think about death, and then we measure either their attitudes or their behavior towards other individuals who either share their beliefs about the nature of reality or who are very different. And what we find consistently is that reminders of death make people more enthusiastic and benevolent towards others who share their beliefs, and more negative and hostile towards those who are different. So, for example, when Christian participants are asked to think about death as opposed to something else relatively unpleasant but not fatal, they like fellow Christians more, and they like Jewish participants less. When we go to Israel and ask Jewish people to think about death, they like Jewish people more and Arab people less. These effects have been replicated by independent researchers in 13 different countries on 5 different continents. The point being not to brag about the volume of work, but to establish its validity vis-a-vis independent reproduction of these effects. All right, how does this help us understand religious terrorism? Very quickly, in the 9 or so minutes. You'll give me like the cut sign, and I'll definitely... There's the timekeeper. Nice. How does this help us understand religious terrorism? Again, noting the difficulties with how we define either of those terms. I like Robert J. Lifton's take on this in a book called Destroying the World to Save It, where Lifton points out that, with some notable exceptions, we should always be somewhat leery of people who claim that God has chosen them to rid the world of evil. That when you look historically, when things do not end well, you generally find that to be a motif that pervades otherwise superficially discrepant situations over time and place. And so in this regard, when we look at the perpetrators of the events of 9/11, I think there's ample evidence that this is indeed the case. In the 1996 fatwa signed by Osama bin Laden, legitimate or not, bin Laden says the ruling is to kill the Americans and their allies. This is in accordance with the words of Almighty God, to comply with God's order to kill the Americans, to launch the raid on Satan's U.S. troops and the devil's supporters allying with them. So here you have this, God has given me the message, and we need to kill all these people wherever they are. It has already been stated, and I agree wholeheartedly, that the edict of God's emissary to annihilate someone is insufficient in the absence of wholesale community support for endeavors that are in accord with that desire. And in this respect, and this has already been mentioned, it is well known that in some communities, martyrdom or suicide bombing activities are very highly valued social roles that confer self-regard to the individuals who undertake them. So, for example, Nicholas Kristof, writing in April 5, 2002, New York Times at the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, interviews an 8-year-old boy, and he says, the boy showed me a portrait his family had taken of him clutching an AK-47 rifle. He initially lied and said that his older brother was a martyr. Then he hung his head and admitted that, no, his brother is alive and never did anything so grand. I will leave it to you to ponder the, I think, really difficult set of social circumstances where one needs to be embarrassed to be alive. Anyway, we did some work with a colleague in Iran where we asked Iranians to either think about dying or think about something unpleasant. We then showed them a real newspaper article of a martyr, and we asked them, A, do you support martyrdom activities, and B, how much would you like to sign up to become a martyr yourself? And what we found, in accord with our predictions and the conceptual analysis that I've advanced this morning, is that reminders of death increased support for suicide bombing. More frightening, it also increased the willingness of the Iranian participants to sign up to become martyrs. And you can go on the internet and see that there's martyrdom school in Iran, and there's a considerable waiting list. All right, well, let's turn things around in the brief couple of moments that we have together and note that this cuts both ways. I'll go out on a limb here and just say that people are people, and what we see over on that side of Earth is very much mirrored by the opposite side of the same psychological coin on this side of the planet. And at the risk of sounding overly provocative, but I need to be brief in order to get through this, if we look at what's happened after the events of September 11th, what we find is the same thing on this side of the planet. It only took a week after September 11th before President Bush declared that God had chosen him to rid the world of evil. He said, this is a new kind of evil. This crusade is going to take a while. We will rid the world of the evildoers. That's September 17th. On October 22nd, talking to Time magazine reporters, he reported that he is buoyed by his faith that God has chosen him to lead the country during this perilous time. So here you have another instance. God chose me to rid the world of evil. People believed Bush. Lieutenant William Boykin, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense at the Pentagon, said God selected George Bush as president. Why is this man in the White House, he asked. The majority of Americans did not vote for him. Why is he there? And I tell you this morning that he's in the White House because God put him there for a time such as this. The enemy is a spiritual enemy. The enemy is a guy called Satan. So bin Laden says the enemy is Satan. Bush's people say the enemy is Satan. All right, so we did a series of research on this end of the planet. We had Americans think about either dying or about something unpleasant but not fatal. And what we found is that reminders of death had a substantial impact on Americans' political preferences. It increased dramatically their support for President Bush and his policies in Iraq. And in one study 5 weeks before the last presidential election, we found in a sample of registered voters who intended to vote that they preferred Senator Kerry over President Bush by a 4-to-1 margin in benign control conditions. They preferred Bush over Kerry, bless you, by a 2-to-1 margin after a reminder of death. My point being very simply that reminders of death have a very potent influence on people's attitudes. No one accepted the possibility that being asked to think about death might have even remotely influenced how they intended to vote. We did another study where we asked Americans to think about dying or not. I'll make it work. And we then asked them, how do you feel about using nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons against countries who do not threaten us? They were totally gung-ho after a reminder of death as opposed to in control conditions, but this effect was confined only to conservative Americans. All right, well, in my remaining 90 seconds, what can we do to extricate ourselves from these difficulties? And I agree with the excellent presentation that we heard this morning, sir, that we've got to, what's problematic here is that criminal acts are being reframed as sanctified holy behaviors, which creates an exacerbating cycle of escalating violence. What can we do about it? Let's first of all recognize and expose dangerous delusions wherever we see them. I like Michael Ignatieff when he says all things that should scare us in terms of social movements are when the plane of abstract fantasy and the plane of direct experience are never allowed to intersect. And I think that's a good way of thinking about things. Secondly, I think we need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right now, a lot of people are like, oh, religion is the problem. Religion can be problematic, but I like the way Paul Tillich puts it when he says that religion is both potentially incredibly uplifting as well as heinously difficult when it's hijacked by malevolent people that use it in a malignant way. Third, and to emphasize what we've heard already, it'd be good if our policies squared with our values. I heard Kurt Vonnegut talk a couple of decades ago, and he said, oh, people are always pissing and moaning that I'm not a patriotic American. And he said, I am a patriotic American. I merely wish to see in practice what we claim to value in principle. Finally, and I promise I will shut up, I think it's important that as Americans and as humans and co-residents of the planet that we do not, as alarming and difficult as the circumstances are that we now find ourselves in, that we do not succumb to cynicism or despair or go shopping too often, as the President has proposed. And I'll leave you with two thoughts. And one is one of my favorite little snippets from Thomas Hardy that Becker uses as the prologue to Escape from Evil, where Hardy says, if a way to the better be, it comes from taking a look at the worst. And then who knows Camus' The Plague? You know that book, the last sentence translated in English of The Plague is that we learn in times of pestilence that there is more to admire in men than to despise. And I hope he's right. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sheldon. It is a rare man who is able to take a heady topic like that, especially one that is ultimately the combining of psychology and religion, and not only make it humorous, but actually drive home a very important point. Thank you very much. Our next speaker today is Dr. Luis Beres, Professor of International Relations and International Law at Purdue University. He lectures and publishes widely on terrorism and strategy in international law. He is the author of many books and monographs and articles, especially dealing with Israeli security matters, and his work is well known in senior Israeli political, military, and intelligence circles. He is a member of the Advisory Council of the Ariel Center for Policy Research and chairs Project Daniel, a group advising Israel's Prime Minister on existential nuclear questions. His topic today is religious extremism and international legal norms, perfidy, irrationality, and preemption.
Am I going to work with that?
Yep, you can come on up.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. The microphone is up. Can I move it? Okay, good. That's a tough act to follow. Couldn't you have scheduled me before? I just mentioned to Sheldon that his closing quote from Hardy reminded me of a line from the poet René, which is similar. He says, "In a dark time, the eye begins to see." And one would hope, perhaps, that in this increasingly dark time, we'd have some insight. Having said that, I'm not sure that you're going to agree with my particular take, although Sheldon and I are clearly kindred spirits in terms of our interest in literature and philosophy. We're going to come to rather different conclusions. I may sound more like the law school speaker than the philosopher here. But there have been remarkable juxtapositions, I think, between the speakers. And I don't know if this was a brilliance that Amos must have figured out, but I'm listening to all these guys and I'm thinking, wow, you know, these are all kindred spirits. Well, let me also begin with somewhat of a literary reference. I'm thinking here of the French dramatist and diplomat Jean Giraudoux, and he inquires in one of his plays, he says, "C'est beau, n'est-ce pas, la fin du monde?" It's beautiful, isn't it, the end of the world? Yeah. And I think here of the ironic playwright who explodes this myth of an ordered cosmos. The contemporary, like this ironic playwright, the contemporary terrorist often sees great beauty in the ultimate form of disorder, in chaotic visions of an apocalyptic end. We've heard so much of this already this morning, to heresy, blasphemy, apostasy, and all other forms of unbelief. And for this terrorist, who remains defined, obviously, in many different ways, as we have seen also this morning, by the diverse worlds of law and politics, violence is not only a sacred path to universal cleansing and redemption, it is the only path. And what is more, this path, to continue the metaphor, is more than just a means to an end. It is, in essence, the end unto itself. For the individual terrorist, and today we mean, I would still use the term jihadist terrorist, notwithstanding some of the comments we've heard this morning, but from which I've learned a great deal. But just to give you an idea of who I think we're referring to, the jihadist terrorist, whether or not he abuses the term, violent destruction of blasphemers, infidels, and apostates is incontestably a distinct form of religious sacrifice. And I think here of this concept of sacrifice. I think also of someone who's not been mentioned yet this morning. I'm sure Sheldon knows René Girard, the violence and the sacred. In some respects, that could almost be the textbook for this conference. And as is the case with all such forms of worship, sacrifice is meant to alleviate the death fear of the perpetrator, the high priest, by bringing death to others. And again, I think of the earlier references to Ernest Becker. This whole notion of relieving the death fear, or perhaps even Otto Rank, I think, from whom Becker drew so much of his intellectual sustenance. It's generally believed that the suicide bomber is fearless. We think of him as cruel, but nonetheless fearless, and that he is willing and even eager to die. Usually we think, he says, for the greater glory of God. But in fact, nothing could be farther from the truth. The suicide bomber kills himself precisely in order to avoid death. And again, I think here of the earlier remarks by Jerry and Sheldon and the references to Becker and Rank. And here we have to understand that the death the suicide bomber expects to suffer is little more than a momentary inconvenience on the way to eternal life. The death that he expects to suffer is really basically his path, his preferred, his optimal only path to immortality. Robert Lifton, the future of immortality. Paradoxically, therefore, it is his or her, and now we have to say his or her, exceptionally acute fear of death that occasions suicide. Together with the compelling promise, we need to note, I think, and I'm not sure this has been mentioned yet, of sexual fulfillment. There is a sexual component here. Now, 2 weeks ago, I gave a keynote address at a conference called the Intelligence Summit. And at the Intelligence Summit were a number of Muslims who were speaking against Islamic terror and who made a variety of different points. And one was an Egyptian doctor who told me about his education at an Egyptian medical school many years ago, in which part of the lecturing that was done in the medical school had to do with imbuing the students with a preference for death as shaheed, as a martyr. And he spoke of a conscious and very deliberate keeping of the students away from any kind of sexual opportunity, a form of explicit and systematic sexual denial, which was part of what he called his term brainwashing, to make him amenable to becoming a suicide bombing terrorist. And he and I had dinner that night. I wanted to pursue this line of inquiry with him. And he leaned over to me and he told me, after the several years of his medical education that included this conscious form of sexual deprivation, he said, and I quote him, he said, "I would have killed anybody to get into heaven." Now, it may be, again, as we heard this morning, that there is no explicit reference to the 72 virgins anywhere in the Quran, and I certainly defer to the prior speaker on that point, because I'm not remotely sophisticated, in any way comparably knowledgeable about this. But I do know that there are a great many portions of the Islamic world, the Arab Islamic world, where this expectation is palpable, literal, not metaphoric, in which it's believed that whether or not one finds it, its authenticated source in the Quran, they act as if they do. Now, this important conference is exploring links between sacred violence, religion, and terrorism, which makes it, I think, a conference on the most important possible juxtaposition of themes imaginable in the world today. And again, I commend Amos and his colleagues for thinking of such a vitally important combination. And on its face, this dreadful connection between violence and terrorism seems to be a function of religion. Now, I've written this in my text long before listening to all the other speakers who have made precisely the same point, so I sound a bit redundant to you. And we know that religion, more specifically today, certain elements of Islam, whether or not abusing the true tenets of that faith, are allegedly the root cause of that problem. And to a certain extent, this is certainly not incorrect. But I would argue further, and again, I think in keeping with my prior speaker here, that religion here is epiphenomenal. That it is not the actual underlying cause, but rather the visible part of something much deeper. And that is a very deep and enduring pathology in the human spirit. And it is now especially pervasive in certain, what I still would call jihadist elements of Islam. Now, I refer to human death fear, a fear about which much has been written from the time of, I can throw in some new names here that have not been yet raised. I think of Epicurus, Lucretius, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. Going to Nietzsche, Freud, we've talked about. The American philosopher Santayana spoke interestingly about this concept as well, and Ernest Becker. There's also a great deal, I think, that we can learn here, and since we're adding philosophical elements to the jurisprudential, from the Spanish existentialist Miguel de Unamuno, whose tragic sense of life has a marvelous chapter on the rationalist dissolution, and another on what he calls the hunger of immortality. The hunger of immortality. How underestimated and ignored is this primal hunger in our still limited understanding of terrorism, religion, and sacred violence. And I'm not sure how welcome Unamuno is among the lawyers, but I think since they've already been hearing from the psychologists and the philosophers, I'm not going to be terribly out of bounds any longer. Now, oddly enough, we, especially Americans and Canadians, Australians and Europeans, are fond of projecting our own sense of rationality upon our adversaries. Acknowledging that Western philosophy has always oscillated between Plato and Nietzsche, between rationalism and irrationalism, we have unthinkingly cast our lot with the Greeks and their inheritors. But we're now up against an entirely different ordering of the universe, and I think we would actually do better, as opponents of terrorism, to read Dostoevsky or Kafka than to dwell on Grotius, Pufendorf, or even Jefferson. And again, this is idiosyncratic stuff to say at a law school. The side of me that deals with international law, and I am a professor of international law, talks about the sanctity of Grotius. And Grotius was brilliant. What he was able to do in the 17th century was absolutely remarkable. And Pufendorf and their influence on the founding fathers and so on and so forth. But the presumption of rationality, which they derived from the ancients and from Cicero and so on, is at odds with the greater wisdom of Dostoevsky and Kafka and someone mentioned Kierkegaard as well, about the primacy of human passion. We're not basically a rational species. We all do crazy things that are wholly irrational and wholly out of sync with any careful calculation of costs and benefits. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I can think in my own life of a dozen things that I've done that are absolutely preposterous. I won't tell you what they are. But when I look back, I said, I can't imagine that I did this. And the answer, of course, is I did this because I'm human and I'm not a rational economic man thinking about the prospective costs and benefits of alternative courses of action. We need to think about this in the context of the war on terror. Now, as you can tell, I'm fond personally of understanding everything, including international law and counterterrorism, through drama, art, and literature. And I began my remarks with a reference to Giraudoux. Let me switch to another dramatist, the Italian playwright Luigi Pirandello, to illustrate another point about rationality. In his play, Henry IV, Pirandello confronts us with what he calls the logic of madness, a logic before which all of the rational rules of behavior crumble. And just to read you this brief quote from Pirandello's Henry IV, he says, and think about this in the context of all that we've said this morning about the suicide bomber. Do you know what it means to find yourselves face to face with a madman, with one who shakes the foundations of all you have built up in yourselves, your logic, the logic of all your constructions? Madmen, lucky folk, construct without logic, or rather with a logic that flies like a feather. I'm not sure that our present terrorist enemies should technically be characterized as mad, but in a practical sense, they are certainly energized by a wholly different hierarchy of preferences and values. From the standpoint of international law, we must absolutely begin to understand the limits of imposing our own notions of compliance and justice upon an altogether different kind of civilization. I say this recognizing also the universality of certain human inclinations that came to mind listening to Jerry's remarks and the references to Freud. For the Judeo-Christian world, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 put a legal end to the idea that an enemy in war was a criminal or heretic upon whom one necessarily waged a war of annihilation. And here, following the 30 Years' War, the idea crystallized and became codified that an opponent was essentially a just enemy, an enemy upon whom one waged limited war. And here we can think of the lawyers amongst us here of the St. Petersburg Declaration of 1868, the St. Petersburg Declaration. The means that can be used to injure an enemy are not unlimited. And think about how at odds that ethos is, the Declaration of St. Petersburg of 1868, with the current notions of terror war against the Judeo-Christian West. Although there have surely been instances of absolutely profound disregard for this transforming idea, the idea of limits to warfare, and also in the Judeo-Christian West, not by any means necessarily exclusively in the Islamic world, it has at least been acknowledged in principle as normatively binding, as authoritative. Significantly, however, the present and seemingly immutable cry of jihad, again, whether or not the term is being abused, represents a pre-Westphalian notion of total war that is premised upon the enemy's, which means us, the enemy's irremediable lack of sacredness. Now, I remember an interview with an Islamic jihad leader after a deliberate attack on a civilian area in Israel where young children were killed, and the interviewer asked the Islamic jihad authority spokesperson, how can you justify the killing of Jewish children? And he said, and I quote, they lack sacredness. They lack sacredness. Now, whether or not that's an eccentric, idiosyncratic expression of the Islamic world today, it does reflect the views of a great many people in that world, and it makes it very difficult to combat them by applying the presumptions of rationality that inhere in Western international law. So to understand the vital linkages between sacred violence, religion, and terror, which is our task here today, we first need to understand that our present enemies wholly reject our post-Westphalian system of international law, the whole bloody system. This is a stunning rejection, one with unimaginably grave implications for the so-called war on terror, as well as the counter-proliferation effort. It means, among other things, that all prevailing jurisprudential ideas of treaty-based agreement and the other sources of international law identified in Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice are effectively binding only upon us. We are therefore now contending with adversaries who don't even accept the most minimal jurisprudential assumptions regarding tenets as compromise, negotiation, peaceful settlement, or even humanitarian international law, especially the law of armed conflict. There is no consensus of agreement of any kind on these issues. For them, for the most part, international life is a zero-sum game, and the only acceptable outcome of this game is the transformation of the Dar al-Harb into the Dar al-Islam, the world of war into the world of Islam. By itself, violence is not necessarily irrational, and in the words of René Girard, whose book, again, Violence and the Sacred, is something everybody here absolutely should be reading as an underlying text. In his words, violence does have its reasons. Not always, but sometimes. Here is more of what Girard has to say with his usual level of insight. And let me quote Girard briefly. He says, "When unappeased, violence seeks and always finds a surrogate victim. The creature that excited its fury is abruptly replaced by another, chosen only because it is vulnerable and close at hand." Now, what does this mean to us here at this conference? Consider the endlessly cruel and purposely indiscriminate Palestinian insurgency against Israel. What happens when the Israelis build a wall and make the Palestinian sacrificial killings, the suicide bombings, more difficult? Then the Palestinian Arabs, at least elements of them, begin to slaughter each other, at least organizationally. Hamas begins to murder Fatah. Fatah begins to murder Hamas until they reconcile temporarily, whereupon they both resume the murder of Jews and others that they regard as lacking sacredness. This, of course, can be read at a variety of different websites. And I get all the texts from the Middle East every morning from the various Arab press and so forth. It's very clear that the reference is always, by the way, very significantly to Jews, not to Israelis. When I hear the Islamic Jihad spokesperson make the reference to why it was okay to kill the children, he refers to the killing of the Jews. It's always the Jews, if you look at the website, never the Israelis. Among the Palestinians and amidst the Arab Islamic terrorist groups in general, sacred violence always, I said among the Palestinians and amidst the Arab Islamic terrorist groups in general, sacred violence always draws upon this repressed or thwarted male sexuality. And again, I refer to my acquaintance, the Egyptian doctor with whom I spoke a couple of weeks ago. It's hardly a coincidence that sacred violence is now most common in certain parts of the Arab Islamic world where repressed male sexual desire accumulates, to use the imagery of René Girard, a relentless energy that sooner or later must burst forth. And most of the world watches the jihadist orchestrations of terror and believe this sacred violence is essentially political or revolutionary. And my colleague this morning made some references to changing political orientations and so forth to reduce the likelihood of terror from these sources, and I don't disagree. I'm sure that there's considerable wisdom in that. On the other hand, there are also large segments of the population which will not respond in any way to any sort of Western political concessions. This is a law school conference. It's important, therefore, that we draw upon creative, literary, and anthropological insights to better understand the sacred violence, but we also need to know more about the jurisprudentially normative controls. And let me turn to that. I have another 5 or 10 minutes? Yes, okay. Yes, because I'm replicating the cadence of Sheldon here because I'm normally a slow speaker, but you know, if you think that I'm talking too fast, it's not my fault. What are the vital connections? A number of major points I think need to be made. First, international law does permit, and this is a point that was made earlier by some of the speakers as well, and made correctly, international law does permit various expressions of organized violence, including not only just wars, which of course begins with the Hebrew Bible and with Aristotle, but also certain forms of insurgency. We know about the General Assembly definition of aggression, the 1974 General Assembly definition of aggression, numerous General Assembly resolutions which in essence have the effect of being customary expressions of customary international law and so forth. We've known for a long time that national liberation and self-determination are perfectly appropriate legal reasons for the assertion of insurgency. There's ample evidence for this. At the same time, we must recall that every use of force in international law must always be judged twice. Once with regard to the justness of the cause, the jus ad bellum issue, and once with regard to the justness of the means, the jus in bello issue. And again, somebody made this point, I think, this morning correctly, that once the use of force is deliberately applied to non-combatants, irrespective of the justice of the cause. We have criminal behavior specifically. We have terroristic behavior. So we need to think here in terms of humanitarian international law or the law of armed conflict. Whatever authoritative sources we examine at Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, and I think this should include natural law, which underlies all positive or codified international law, a point which I disagreed with my friend Michel at dinner last night. Insurgents are expected to comply with the basic principles of the Martins Clause, and the St. Petersburg Declaration, again, of 1868, that the means that can be used to injure an enemy are not unlimited. This means that no matter how just the cause of an insurgent group engaged in sacred violence, any resort to unjust means is automatically, ipso facto, an incontestable indication of terror. Again, Parvez made this point correctly this morning. Philosophically, the just cause problem here is international law's mistaken emphasis on a collective self. And here I come back to my philosopher friends leaving the legal friends, and I'm making what I thought to be a rather idiosyncratic argument here, that if our jurisprudence had sought to determine the self of the individual human being, not the self of the aspiring nation state, not the primal horde of Freud, or the herd of Nietzsche, or the crowd of Kierkegaard, I think you mentioned Kierkegaard, not the crowd of Kierkegaard. We would instead be on the gainful path to some serious resolution of terrorism and sacred violence. In this connection, I would also add the word of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, as well as the American transcendentalists, especially Emerson and Thoreau, as being quite helpful. Now, the title of my remarks includes the word perfidy, and I want to be sure to get that into the picture here. Most of us already know that perfidy is a codified violation of the law of war, primarily Geneva law. We see it in Geneva 4, Article 28, and Article 147, where it's characterized as a grave breach. And this has the effect of placing jurisprudential responsibility for pertinent non-combatant harms entirely upon the perfidious party. In other words, the legal effect of perfidy is exculpatory for the party that is actually inflicting the harms, so long as the party itself has just cause and for its resort to force, and seeks to minimize collateral harms within the bounds of what we call military necessity. Which brings us to Iran and the area of the real world with which I'm concerned pretty much on a day-to-day basis, the issue of a nuclearizing Iran, the possibility that a nuclearizing Iran would fuse with a departure from rationality, and that this nuclearizing Iran that could depart from rationality by the usual rules of deterrence has been explicitly genocidal. The fusion of those three elements is quite ominous. The president of Iran has repeatedly called openly for genocide against the state of Israel. I mean this in the jurisprudential sense of the 1948 treaty, which entered into force in 1951, the Genocide Convention, which specifically criminalizes as intention to commit genocide the sorts of statements being made by the president of Iran. Assuming that Israel, therefore, would have a right under customary international law of anticipatory self-defense against Iran, what are the many Iranian civilians who might die in the Israeli preemptive strike? This is an issue which I can assure you is a real issue at this very moment, a real policy question. As Iran has very purposefully moved non-combatants into areas with sensitive nuclear targets, I don't mean necessarily weapons, but even information and so forth, and has purposefully moved certain sensitive nuclear structures and assets into non-combatant residential areas, the full legal responsibility for any harms that would accrue to these populations from an essential act of Israeli anticipatory self-defense would fall upon Iran. And this is an important point to keep in mind, because many people think, well, the Israelis have no right to attack preemptively even as an expression of anticipatory self-defense, because hundreds or even thousands of Iranians would die. Well, that is very likely the case, but from a narrowly jurisprudential sense, the responsibility for those deaths under the legal principle of perfidy would be an Iranian responsibility, not an Israeli responsibility. I've been working on these issues for the last several years. Some of you know as chair of this group called Project Daniel, and we were 6 who prepared a specific report called Israel's Strategic Future to the former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. And I have written in the last 3 weeks 3 articles with 3 generals about the issue of anticipatory self-defense. I brought copies of all three with me, and some of you may have them. Two with retired American generals, Tom McInerney, an American Air Force general, and Paul Vallely, an American Army general. The last with Major General Reserve Itzik Ben Israel, who was a member of the IDF General Staff. And I thought it was quite remarkable that Isaac Ben Israel, who was a member of the General Staff and was a member of my 6-person Project Daniel group, would in fact have been willing to go on record in the Washington Times in support of anticipatory self-defense, openly acknowledging Israel's nuclear capacity. In the case of Iran and Israel, sacred violence is what animates Iranian nuclearization. In this case, the Iranian perfidy, which is now codified primarily at Geneva law, could have the effect of deterring an Israeli preemption. And again, this would follow from Israeli concerns about injuring and killing Iranian non-combatants. Nonetheless, from the standpoint of law, Israel would not need to be deterred. And this brings me, what have I got, 5 minutes? Or get toward the ends here, okay. I'm looking for numbers. You're not showing me numbers. All right, I'll get to the end. I'm never going to make it to the end, so let me just sort of round off. I'm not going to do this. Let me round off by saying that in conclusion, the idea of irrationality is absolutely essential here, and that the juxtaposition of these terms in my title, irrationality, perfidy, and preemption, is very significant. All of them, there's a synergistic relationship between them. And in dealing with the threat of terror generally and mega terror or mass casualty terror in particular, we worry especially about the fusion of irrationality with this kind of asset. We think, for example, about Iran as potentially the suicide bomber in macrocosm, writ large. What do you do? Now, one option, my last 30 seconds, I promise, is to heighten the effectiveness of ballistic missile defense. And this is what General Ben Israel and I wrote about in our Washington Times piece a couple of weeks ago. And we concluded that even if ballistic missile defense, called active defense in the military, were 98% or so effective, that would be insufficient, because a 2% leakage rate when the incoming missiles carry chemical, biological, especially nuclear and biological warheads, would be unsatisfactory, could kill 1 million Israelis. Therefore, Israel, we're speaking from the Israeli point of view, cannot rely in the situation with Iran upon ballistic missile defense. It cannot rely upon strategic deterrence as the Soviets and the Americans had during the Cold War, because the presumption of rationality may be immobilized. Therefore, the only thing that comes up is the idea of leaving aside the philosophical human transformations that we like to think about. In the short term, the only thing that comes up is preemption. And if I had another hour and a half, I'd talk to you. Well, we do have in the question and answer some statements about the notion of anticipatory self-defense, how it can be justified under international law, and how ultimately it's applicable in these cases. So I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Beres, and thank you for your excellent presentation, too. I was reminded in the presentation from a slightly different context of something that Justice Scalia wrote in a campaign finance case, in which he said that it was a case responding to Congress's efforts to regulate soft money. The idea that we can change the political process and make people behave in irrational manners as a result of money. And he said that the Constitution, our American Constitution, assumes that people are neither sheep nor stupid, right? Or we can change it to irrational as well. And that if that presumption is wrong, we have more things to worry about than soft money. And I think with both of the presenters, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator here, to raise this question of, well, if it is true that, and I would agree with Dr. Beres in many instances, there is a tremendous amount of irrationality in the world, and that this irrationality, to segue to Dr. Solomon's work, is in part endemic in the human condition, in our response to death, and that it's in fact exacerbated by our efforts to distinguish, right, our perspective and our worldview from others, right? So in fact, enlightening people, for example, is in fact going to cause this greater distinction and a greater separation. How do we respond? Is it, as Dr. Beres suggests, that the only response is preemptively, to strike before we are stricken against, and especially in a society committed to freedom? How do we control the concerns and the problems generated by not only the psychology, but the potential pathology of human nature?
Oh, that was the question.
That is to both of
It's
you.
a good thing I listened. Yeah. Is this microphone? It's on. Yes. Okay. I'd respond by saying that it's an important question. That in principle, I would like not to end up with a pragmatic reference to preemption, and in some way, it's objectionable, certainly at the humanistic level, and it would seem to indicate a lack of imagination on my part. However, I think in the short term, we do need to think in those rather narrowly pragmatic terms. In the long term, I think what we need to do, going back to some of our notions about death, fear, and individual affirmations, we need above all else, I'm going to come back to Jung as well here, to affirm ourselves as individuals who can form a cosmopolis in the world and whose loyalty is primarily to the planet as a whole, because we are fundamentally individual human beings rather than members. So I think of the Freudian idea of the horde, or the Nietzschean idea of the herd, and the Kierkegaardian idea of the crowd. We've got to get away from that. We ultimately have to turn to people like Emerson and to Kierkegaard, recognize that we are fundamentally human beings, that the commonality that we have as human beings greatly outweighs the differentiations that we impose by virtue of ethnicity, religion, race, and so forth, which are essentially nonsense. And if we could begin to acknowledge ourselves as fundamentally as human beings, we'd begin to finally disengage ourselves from the competing herds that give rise to terror.
Ditto. Just to add to that, just from a purely egghead point of view, our research, the following up on the studies that I described, where we found that when we ask people to think about dying, that produces exaggerated defensive reactions to folks who are different. What we've done since then are a series of studies where we've examined mitigating factors. And the most uplifting recent set of them has to do with reminding people of their common humanity. So we tell people, hey, every two people on the planet have more in common than we are different. In fact, not to go evolutionary on you, but every human on Earth is directly descended from a tiny band of proto-humans, no greater than 2,000 folks in a single neighborhood in southeastern Africa. So when we tell people people have a lot in common, that eliminates the defensive reactions that our mortality salience induction otherwise provokes. When people are trained in a clinical setting to come to terms with their own mortality, that also seems to erase these mortality salience effects. I haven't gotten there yet myself, but I think that's at least the direction to go in. Reminding people that Americans value tolerance also reduces these mortality salience effects. So too does raising self-esteem. And so, at least from a purely research perspective, I think there are promising directions. Whether or not they could be practically implemented is another question entirely.
Dr. Beres, you mentioned a book as being foundational, and I didn't catch it. Could you say it again?
Yes, René Girard, Girard, Violence and the Sacred. He's written a number of things on the concept of sacrifice, but again, it would be an absolutely perfect text for the conference. René Girard, Violence and the Sacred. He's a professor of French literature at Stanford right now.
And one additional question. I wonder what effect your study, Dr. Solomon, with all the particularly teenage boys and the violent games they watch and use on their computers.
Good question. We're actually looking at that now. I'm going to be evasive and timid and say I'll get back to you when we have the results. But our suspicion is that violent video games, and this is based on other folks' work, really inoculates human beings as to the effects of violent behavior. There's been a slew written about how the most recent wars are basically video game wars. We look forward to seeing the CNN depictions of things exploding from miles in the sky. And I must confess, it's kind of fun till I realize what it is that I'm actually watching.
Okay, this is a question for Professor Beres.
Good.
I want to know what elements you see as defining. Can you hear me?
Barely.
Okay, what would be the elements of preemptive or anticipatory self-defense in your view? And using those elements, would Iran, for example, be able to look at their perception of American behavior in Iraq and Afghanistan as irrational? Would they then be able to use the same elements to justify an attack against the U.S. or possibly Israel?
Okay, the question has two parts. The first part sort of asks me, I think what you're asking is this essential criteria that would have to be satisfied under international law to permissibly invoke anticipatory self-defense. The doctrine in customary international law comes from this 1837 incident called the Caroline. And the main opinion that comes out of that is that the danger posed must be, quote unquote, imminent in point of time. Imminent in point of time. Obviously, the notion of imminence in point of time is intrinsically subjective. However, in 1837, they didn't worry about nuclear attack. I think we need to recognize that that concept of imminence has got to be reinterpreted in the light of a situation where one country has existential power over another in a matter of seconds. Therefore, it would seem to me that every state has the right to self-protection and self-defense, a right which is in fact reinforced, interestingly enough, by the International Court of Justice in its 1996 advisory opinion on the lawfulness of nuclear weapons, which in fact concluded that a country, even a state, even has the right to use nuclear weapons is a residual right if the only alternative is to be made to disappear, if it is facing a genocidal destruction. So I would argue that under current circumstances, the definition, the jurisprudential definition of imminence from customary international law, it can be quite broadly construed so that a state doesn't have to sit down. International law is not a suicide pact. I think that's the point to keep in mind. Now, your second point was whether or not, which elements did you say could point to the United States and justify attacking? Was it?
Well, arguably, if...
Yeah, I forgot the actual reference.
No, the question was whether Iran, in light of,
Iran,
I think it was Seymour Hersh had an article in the New Yorker about plans to possibly attack Iran, whether Iran would then have an argument of preemptive self-defense against the United States.
I see. Whether Iran could now invoke the same principle of customary international law. There's a certain circularity to this, of course, and almost gets into kind of the theater of the absurd as opposed to international law. I would argue, of course, that they do not have such a right because there is a difference in international law between aggression and self-defense. And the interests of the United States in this theater of conflict and those of Israel, for sure, are entirely defensive. There's also the matter which the lawyers will appreciate. I'm not a lawyer, by the way. I'm a PhD political scientist. But the lawyers will appreciate more, and that is the legal notion of intent. I mean, here, neither the Americans nor the Israelis have ever talked about openly committing genocide as a matter of public policy, whereas this is what one hears as an incantation from Tehran every day. Therefore, the explicitly genocidal intent made from Tehran in total contradiction to what one hears from Washington or Jerusalem indicates that they're dissimilar situations that they would not have such a right.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question here. The conflict is one between civilizations here. We have Western civilization on one hand and Eastern thought on the other hand. And we go by certain rules, and they believe in other rules that are maybe contrary to ours. And those conflicts result in the wars that we are experiencing. The alternative to actual warfare is education. And in the sense of politics and warfare, psy-war or psychological warfare, which is the thing that we're not doing, we're not projecting our viewpoints correctly into the rest of the world. And we think one way, which is totally different from our opponents. And if we don't want to fight them, we're going to have to re-educate them.
That's your question. I think you're more subtle on that point than I am. Go ahead.
Go, you go.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the question of re-education I would sort of respond to in two ways. In principle, it's a lovely idea. But we're facing very pragmatic threats that are palpable, concrete, and potentially mega destructive. Therefore, I'm torn. One side of me favors sort of literary, poetic, humanistic, artistic orientations of the world, but they're not good. I live in two worlds. On one hand, I'm doing this stuff as a university professor. I sit down by myself and I write all of these nice thoughts, and I'm very pleased by that. And then I go to Washington and I talk to these Army general friends of mine, or in Jerusalem. If I started talking to them about Kierkegaard, they would say, "What are you talking about? I mean, come on, give me a break." They don't want to know about this. They don't want to know about humanism and individualism and the end of the primal horde. They want to know what are we going to do tomorrow morning. Therefore, we're conflicted here. And the only sensible answer I can give to the situation is to look long-term to much more profound changes that reflect Sheldon's correct reference to our commonality. But in the short term, prepare to use whatever is necessary to survive, and that includes preemptive force.
That's the question. How do we get there? The short term is where we're at now. And I agree 100% with you. I'm torn both ways, being from the military and being a civilian for so many years. How do we get from the one to the other?
Just flustered because any truly important question with practical implications eludes me as a professor.
I'll add a note to that.
Having said that, though, my gut reaction, and I know this is, again, it's naive because I like Luis's point that he's torn between two worlds, and I'm comfortably embedded in the academic one, which spares me the consequences of having to suffer the implications of what I profess to believe. One thing, though, that comes to mind is that we work with Iranian psychologists, and they are very profoundly intelligent and decent humans. And when the concern arises that the Western point of view is egregiously misunderstood, their reaction, of course, is that this cuts both ways, that there is mutual misunderstanding that is best overcome by direct contact from folks of goodwill on both sides. And now, again, I sound ridiculous, like we should hook arms and sing Kumbaya around the campfire and have a Twinkie to share, or something perhaps more nutritious. But I think one way just of making headway is to say, yes, that's half of the equation. I think the other half is to render ourselves equally educated and, at least in theory, respectful of the perspective from which these other folks come. Meanwhile, same thing as what Luis says. When my colleagues and I talk to people like in NATO or in military venues, the immediate response is, yes, that's all fine. Now get out of the way. We're busy.
Well, just one point that I'd add to that, and that is that we don't acknowledge the fact that a great many people enjoy killing. And that there is something that is not maladaptive. I mean, it is maladaptive, of course, to the society and to the civilization. But from the individual point of view, there's great joy. This has been pointed out experimentally as well. And I think also of Ionesco, the Romanian playwright, who said people kill other people to prove life exists. Did I get that right, Jerry? We were talking about Otto Rank last night. Otto Rank as well. Rank and Ionesco both make this point, I think, quite correctly. Rank says, man looks out over a huge field of corpses and feels marvelous. Proclaims life good. Now, this is something, especially, we can't even relate to this, and we think this is perverse. Well, it may be perverse, but there's obviously substantial evidence that a great many human beings feel this way.
Professor Beres, apparently you have some insight into the motivations of the State of Israel, and in terms of our country's preemptive attack in Iraq, we being quite a few miles distant in missile range, more so than Israel from Iraq. And since we have already preemptively struck Iraq because we were in mortal danger from their weapons of mass destruction, can you tell us why the State of Israel, who is also anathema to Iraq, did not preemptively strike Iraq?
Okay, I recognize the heavy irony of the question. That's okay. But I should point out historically that on June 7, 1981, the Israelis did strike Sirak, the reactor outside of Baghdad. They did that with a cost of 1 fatality. They did it before the reactor went online. It's probably the one reason that American forces and others did not encounter Iraqi weapons of mass destruction during the first Gulf War. So there is considerable evidence that the actions of what I would call anticipatory self-defense by the Israelis in 1981 were entirely productive of peace. Now, I think also implicit in your question is the idea that Iraq was wrong because there was no real threat to us. Therefore, ipso facto, Iran is wrong. I would argue that Iran and Iraq are entirely different situations, and that whatever we think of the Iraq war ought not necessarily to drive us to condemn the prospect of anticipatory self-defense against Iran. There is good reason to believe that a nuclear Iran would share various nuclear technologies with various surrogates in that part of the world, and that the dangers posed by these nuclear assets would be faced not only in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, but also Washington, Chicago, and New York. In 1977, I wrote a book on nuclear terrorism in the late 1970s, and the academic reaction was this was really nonsense. The attitude was this was preposterous, it was implausible. We will never see the day where individual insurgents have access to nuclear explosives or radioactivity. Well, now we know that. We know the threat of nuclear terrorism is distinctly plausible. And we need to recognize that one of the principal paths to this will be through a nuclear Iran.
This is going to be difficult. I won't try to use heavy irony to indicate, on the one hand, my vigorous disagreement with much that Professor Beres has said. We're always going to be coming back to the question of definition that the first questioner asked about. I want to suggest to you, every one of us here is going to form some kind of definition of terror. That definition, I think, is going to be a function of a word we haven't yet used this morning, I believe, and that is ideology. Every definition of terror has the function of othering someone or some group or some nation and producing a solidarity for a we that we keep invoking. What's striking to me in terms of that is that we seem to be fixated on discussing terror as if it applied to the other. And one of the ways we do that is we keep referring to suicidal terror. What's striking to me is that the first act of global terrorism was not a suicidal act. And why the suicidal act is such a fixation is interesting to me. In case anybody's wondering what I'm referring to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first act of global terrorism. Moreover, there's a kind of terrorism going on in Iraq right now that we don't talk about, and that's the use of depleted uranium munitions in Iraq. Again, a kind of terrorism that we don't talk about because we don't use the stupid language that Ahmadinejad uses. We have a much subtler language to justify our policies and to disguise our policies. Ideology, the basic function of ideology is the definition that you accept is the one that will be a function of your own blindness, as will mine.
Well, to try to rephrase that, is that an issue of, well, no, and seriously, that here we're trying to justify in some respects the Western response, or at least the United States and Israel's response to terrorism. And is the effort at justification itself going to create divisions, right, and not only, one, provoke and encourage greater violence and greater antagonism, or is it really the path, at least to a short-term solution? Right? I mean, is it the long-term winning of hearts and minds that's the only appropriate solution, or are there short-term benefits and short-term justifications to be gained that don't, in fact, end up dividing both groups? And I wouldn't say it's Western or Eastern, right? I mean, you can say that, as Professor Sheldon's discussion talks about, as Solomon's discussion talks about, that this is within groups, even subgroups, right? And then this is, in the end, how these subgroups define themselves.
You take that.
Many elements to my friend's comment that we spoke yesterday evening about this, some of these issues. I hate to get us back to definition because that can get boring. But there is this notion, again, because your allegation that the first act of terror was the use of nuclear weapons by the United States against the Japanese and so forth. That gets us away from a properly jurisprudential definition and confuses the issue of humanitarian international law, the law of armed conflict, with the issues of insurgency and the rightfulness of insurgents to use force. If we embrace a definition of terror so broad that it would encompass even war crimes or alleged war crimes by particular states, then the concept of terror, I think, will become meaningless. So I think we do at least need to restrict it to the idea of insurgent uses of force involving elements of just cause and just means.
You've illustrated my point that all definitions are functions of ideology. And it's very interesting that we refer to international law when it supports us, U.S. and Israel, and when it doesn't, we tell it to go to hell.
No, but I think that the definition of terrorism is antecedent to the issue here. I think we basically in the jurisprudential community have understood that the notion of terror always involves the use of violence by non-state actors. Once we begin to embrace the use of violence by states as well as non-states, I don't think it's an ideological commitment, but it waters down the meaningfulness of the terrorist concept.
That's a perfect example. You want to have a definition that will make it impossible to talk about state violence as a form.
No, on the contrary, we can continue to talk about state violence, but not jurisprudentially as an expression of terrorism. We can talk about it as a violation of the law of war. We can introduce the use ad bellum issues as well as the use in bello issues, but we just need to know that it's a different category of criminality.
Good enough.
This is directed to Professor Beres. I want you, for the sake of the question, to represent President Bush. He keeps saying that he's going to stay in Iraq until he wins. Would you mind explaining how he will know he has won?
I'm glad you asked that question because it's a question I've asked other people, and I agree with the intent of your question, which is that the concept of victory and defeat is altogether meaningless in this particular context. I think, and even some of my friends and some of my unnamed Army and Air Force general friends with whom I write and speak about victory make me squirm because there is going to be no identifiable victory here and nothing resembling a victory. I think the outcome of this is going to be extremely bad. I think the long-term expectations for Iraq are preposterous as a policy question, and I oppose them altogether. But nonetheless, from a narrowly jurisprudential and philosophical point of view, it's important that the notions of victory and defeat that we once had no longer obtain. Now, some of you may have seen the recent movie, The 300, about the Battle of Thermopylae. I didn't see the movie, but I saw something about it on the History Channel. It reminded me of the fact that in the ancient world, the capacity to destroy required an antecedent capacity to win. Until the Persians defeated the Greeks in 490 BCE at Thermopylae, they could not destroy Attica. Athens began to burn only after they succeeded in defeating Leonidas and his 7,300 of whom were Spartans and so on and so forth. Today we live in a different world in which the capacity to win is not in any way related to the capacity to destroy, which is not good news. The bad news is that we no longer have to be defeated militarily. Where our military leaders are altogether wrong in focusing on victory and defeat is they don't recognize that even if we win by some non-measurable, intangible notion, even if we were to win, we're still entirely vulnerable to a variety of forms of existential destruction. So I would just, I'm glad you asked the question, and I would say that we ought to recognize the inappropriateness of these terms of victory and defeat to the current situation.
A comment and a question to you, Professor Solomon. You were by far and away the most entertaining speaker I've ever seen at a conference like this. And I hope that as compensation for our having signed up, we get notice of your next HBO special. Because I definitely want to be in the audience for that.
Well, thank you.
But taking it to a different plane, perhaps, and intrigued by the comment that the first act of global terrorism was Hiroshima. I'm kind of intrigued. We're halfway through this conference. We've heard about a fringe sect, maybe a religion in Japan. We've heard about the Israeli-Jewish questions and their role in violence. We've heard a lot about the role of Islam. Why hasn't anybody talked about the Catholic Church? Is there no notion that the role of Catholicism has, over the course of time, had some direct relationship to the use of violence in the progress of religion? Or is that not a notion that you gentlemen accept? Please comment. Addressed to both of you.
Well, my comment, as evasive as it sounds, is I do talk about that in my non-speed talking, elaborated presentations. Other folks do at great length. Bruce Hoffman makes direct reference to all the world's major religions in his Inside Terrorism book. Karen Armstrong in The Battle for God has wonderful chapters where she historically traces the precise behaviors that you're suggesting should be part of an explicit discussion of these matters, and I think you're right. And which gets back to the point that I was hopefully trying to make in my entertaining but nevertheless possibly superficial discussion of these matters, and that's that I think psychodynamically speaking, we see the same things happening on both sides of the conflict. Luis?
Yeah, I would just add that, being wholly incapable of reflecting on Catholicism as I suppose my colleague is, and I wouldn't presume to do that, but in a purely dispassionate sort of intellectual way, I would think that the problem of Catholicism with respect to the use of violence is a generic one, by no means specific to Catholicism, and that is the whole notion of us and them, in-group, out-group, the future of immortality, and the promise of immortality to the killing of the non-sacred. And we find that, of course, in the ancient world, in Judaism, we find it historically in Christianity, and now we find it largely in Islam. So I would approach it more as a generic issue of the human, coming back to Becker, and the human death fear, and the way of accomplishing human death fear, which is largely through the slaying of the other. I just add two literary references, one that I mentioned in my formal remarks, Unamuno, who wrote interestingly about issues that I'm not personally sophisticated about Catholicism. The other, a Catholic, a Jesuit philosopher who I do find very intriguing, Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin, the phenomenon of man and the future of man. We were just talking about that. We were talking about that last night. Yeah. So my yeah, Teilhard. Oh, Girard, René Girard. Yeah, I don't know that he would write from a specifically Catholic point of view, but Teilhard de Chardin, who got a lot of trouble with the church, by the way.
We'll have time for one more question.
Yeah, lunchtime. The questions are getting difficult.
Dr. Beres, given that I think these are new times, that I don't believe in the past unless some renegade Soviet or American person with their hand on the button could have done something. You got 6 billion people or so on the earth, and 19 of them probably could change the way that at least the industrialized West lives by spreading destruction, with the nuclear weapons, for instance, killing numbers of people and leaving cities to care for millions of others. Can we rely upon a constitution developed over 200 years ago in this country, and do we already see, and are we going to see more of an erosion, a preemptive strike, if you will, upon the constitutional rights of individuals due to the fact that now we have to worry about our very existence?
Okay, you raise a very fundamental question, which is, I always call it civil liberties versus public safety. Right. That's a complex question for which there is obviously no easy answer. If you believe in the authenticity and the plausibility of the existential threat to the United States, then by definition, we need to be willing to compromise some of those normally codified and sanctified civil liberty. You need to begin to bend on some of those. You need to recognize that we cannot be absolutely rigid in our defense of civil liberties if we feel that the threat to us is existential. There are certain kinds of trade-offs that need to be made. So the first question is, how authentic do we believe these threats happen to be? If, of course, I know in universities, most university professors are more worried about threats to their civil liberties than they are to nuclear terror. However, if nuclear terror is actually undertaken against the United States and we suffer 1 to 3 million dead, then the issue of civil liberties will become moot. Therefore, I mean, this is primarily a subjective judgment, and we're not all going to agree or disagree on the reasonableness of the threat. A prominent political scientist came to Purdue about a month ago, gave a lecture in my department, and he said that he believed that the entire terror threat was a contrivance of the Bush administration to secure public support. That's one point of view. This is a distinguished university professor. He thinks there's absolutely no authenticity to the threat. And I personally think that's nonsense. I think there's a lot we have to worry about. At the same time, we don't want to become so obsessively worried that we allow ourselves to be transformed in a direction of absence of civil liberty.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for participating today.